President-elect Reagan was busy cabinet making today at his home in California. He seems to be getting closer to making some decisions, and if certain final checks work out, there are some people who could be named late this week. Judy Woodruff has more on this.
Sources close to the selection process say if everything falls into place, Mr. Reagan intends to name Caspar Weinberger, the former HEW secretary and current vice president of the Bechtel Corporation, as Secretary of Defense. He intends to name William Casey, former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and more recently Reagan campaign chairman, to be director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The reason these names have not been announced is that checks are still being run on the top contenders for the posts of Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury. Mr. Reagan and his advisors reportedly want to make sure that those positions are filled before they give the Pentagon job to Mr. Weinberger, who they believe could fill any one of the top cabinet posts. Those whom the Reagan team is known to be looking at for Secretary of State include Alexander Haig, former NATO commander, and for Secretary of the Treasury, Walter Wriston, the chairman of Citicorp, and Charles Walker, a former deputy Treasury secretary. There are no cabinet announcements expected until late this week at the earliest. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Just as you know, the Republicans have found a better home for theirs. Tom Pettit, NBC News at the Capitol.
Being baptized into the majority or into the minority on Capitol Hill is just one of Washington's rituals. Another ritual around here is called setting the record straight. Everybody does it occasionally, but those who are leaving Washington are doing it full time, trying during their final days in office to make sure history smiles upon them. The trouble is, those we are now hearing from, we haven't heard from in months. Just this morning, for example, who should turn up on the editorial page of the Washington Post but Mr. Underground himself, Hamilton Jordan, telling us that he went underground because of the gossip columnists. Just 2 weeks ago, Jordan was on Meet the Press and on Bill Moyer's Journal, telling us that if the Carter administration seemed confused, it was because it had tackled too many issues at once. That same week, Mrs. Rosalind Carter invited half a dozen reporters to the White House and told them she thought her husband had been very successful, a great president. Secretary of State Muskie had breakfast with James Reston of the New York Times and told him he watches the sunrise every day from his 8th floor deck at the State Department. 4 days later, Muskie told another Times reporter that National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski should have had his wings clipped. Brzezinski, however, is still flying high and is probably Washington's champion record-setter straighter. On November 14th, he was on the Moyer's Journal on public television. On the morning of November 21st, he was on NBC's Today Show. On the 24th, he did an hour call-in show on the cable news network. On November 28th, he gave 2 long interviews to the Times and the Washington Post, defending himself and blasting the Democrats for being soft on Moscow. All of these interviews may be helpful for the future historians of the Carter administration. But as one newspaperman said today, where were they when we needed them? Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
Ronald Reagan is proceeding very slowly in putting together his cabinet, slower than his schedule had indicated. The Reagan staff first said the cabinet choices would be announced sometime between November 25th and December 10th. Now his people say the first names won't be available until the 10th at the earliest, and it may take until Christmas to announce all the names. Judy Woodruff is in California with the Reagan Group and has more on all this.
Even after setting up an elaborate selection process involving dozens of advisors and executive recruiting experts, President-elect Reagan has run into unexpected obstacles in filling some key cabinet posts. Some of the people whose names were floated early and seriously considered, such as former Treasury Secretary William Simon, ran into unexpected heavy criticism from Republican moderates. Former NATO commander Alexander Haig, who is apparently Mr. Reagan's choice for Secretary of State, is facing questions both about his role in the White House during Watergate and his health. Former Treasury Secretary George Shultz, who also was mentioned early, ran into problems because he works for the Bechtel Corporation, a firm with extensive Arab ties. It also employs Caspar Weinberger, who Mr. Reagan definitely wants in his cabinet as Secretary of Defense or, if need be, at Treasury or State. But what has proven to be most frustrating is the ethics in government law passed 2 years ago and filled with tough disclosure and conflict of interest requirements. The complexity of the law was so underestimated by the Reagan team that it was only a couple of days ago that they realized it would deny them their top choices for at least 2 cabinet posts. Walter Wriston, chairman of Citicorp at Treasury, and former Senator Clifford Hansen at Interior. One source close to the selection process admitted today that so far things have not been handled properly, but he added it's not a disaster. Many decisions have been made. This is an organization that corrects itself slowly, he said, and compared to selecting the Carter cabinet, we're only a little behind schedule. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Pacific Palisades.
One name, John Block, the Agriculture Commissioner of the state of Illinois, is reported tonight to be Reagan's first choice to become Secretary of Agriculture. Block is a hog farmer, and he headed a Farmers for Reagan committee during the campaign. One of those advising Mr. Reagan these days is a California auto dealer named Holmes Tuttle, a self-made millionaire who's an old Reagan friend. We have obtained a document on Tuttle's involvement with the California bank, a document made available to us from sources not in government. It raises questions about some bank transactions, allegations which Tuttle dismisses as political. Details from Brian Ross.
This is a copy of a confidential bank examiner's report prepared earlier this year for the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The report finds that a California bank and its directors are involved in numerous apparent violations of state law and banking regulations involving more than $26 million. The bank is the Community Bank, with 8 branches in Southern California.
The governor asked me to do something.
One of the directors of the bank is this man, Holmes Tuttle, a California millionaire and longtime advisor and fundraiser for Ronald Reagan. Tuttle is now a member of Reagan's so-called kitchen cabinet, involved in the selection of top officials for the Reagan administration. The FDIC report is particularly critical of what it calls insider dealings involving Tuttle and another bank director, Charles Cook. Insider dealings are those between the bank and bank directors, their relatives, and their businesses. In a section headed Violations of Laws and Regulations to Insiders, the bank examiner finds that, quote, most disturbing is the fact that the bulk of the apparent violations relate to Cook-Tuttle insider transactions, unquote. The bank examiner found almost $8 million worth of loans to bank insiders that the examiner called weak and ill-advised, that insiders get preferential interest rates and terms, and that the bank was not diligent in collecting loans to insiders that were overdue. A spokesman for the community bank says the bank has answered the FDIC charges, strongly disagreeing with the findings. The spokesman said the FDIC report is full of errors and biased.
Tuttle refused to be interviewed on camera. He says the community bank is sound and that some of the practices the FDIC is now criticizing have been going on for 30 years. Tuttle says it's all politics, that some of Ronald Reagan's enemies are trying to make this into another Burt Lance case. Brian Ross, NBC News, Los Angeles.
The FDIC, a government agency, is considering what action to take on the bank examiner's report. Ross says its options range from doing nothing at all to issuing a cease and desist order. Edwin Meese, Mr. Reagan's chief aide, was in Washington today talking about the departments of education and energy. On the energy department, Meese said the Reagan administration wants to dismantle it. On the education department, Meese said it is, quote, a ridiculous bureaucratic joke. Meese said the president-elect is still committed to abolish the department.
President-elect Ronald Reagan says he will probably name at least several cabinet appointments next week. While Mr. Reagan relaxed today in California, controversy grew over a major appointment, that of Secretary of State. From Pacific Palisades, California, near the Reagan home, Judy Woodruff has this report.
There were continuing signs today of the difficulty President-elect Reagan seems to be having filling one of the most important jobs in his cabinet, beginning with a story in today's Washington Post detailing problems former NATO commander Alexander Haig would likely face in Senate confirmation hearings. General Haig is believed to be Mr. Reagan's first choice for Secretary of State. Those problems, which some Republicans have been concerned about for weeks, include questions that would surely arise about Haig's role as Chief of Staff to Richard Nixon during the latter days of Watergate, and any later role in President Ford's decision to pardon Mr. Nixon. Today in Washington, Senate Democratic leader Robert Byrd suggested that Haig would have a tough time getting confirmed.
There is a record. Questions have been raised. And the Senate will have a duty to answer those questions for the American people, because any person who is Secretary of State must have the credibility and the integrity to perform in that position. And it is obvious that the Senate is going to look at that record very carefully in the case of General Haig if his nomination is sent to the Senate.
Several Reagan aides dismissed Byrd's comments as inconsequential, but it's likely they'll take the opinion of Senate Republican leader Howard Baker more seriously. Baker has not made a public comment, but NBC has learned that he has cautioned the Reagan team privately about difficulties Haig would face. Whether these and other warning signs will cause Mr. Reagan to look to someone other than Haig for Secretary of State is not known. The president-elect reportedly thinks highly of Haig. But sources close to the selection process say if he does look elsewhere, it could be to former Treasury Secretary George Shultz, who said earlier he wasn't interested but did not completely shut the door. In any event, Republican sources say it's highly unlikely that the Secretary of State will be one of the first cabinet announcements made. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Pacific.
Washington today, but so far this trip has not been anything like his last visit here 3 weeks ago, when everything he touched seemed to turn a political golden. This time his touch has not been so deft, and this time, as John Palmer reports, he has been under constant pressure from his staff and the press about naming a cabinet.
You all keep pressing me about these announcements. You know, I don't know of anyone that's ever announced any this early.
It began this morning, even before the president-elect left New York, reporters wanting to know when the cabinet announcements will be made. Mr. Reagan brushed aside most of the questions, but he did say Nixon's former chief of staff, Alexander Haig, is still being considered for Secretary of State. As the Reagan motorcade passed the White House, heading for Blair House, where the president-elect will stay during his 3.5-day visit, more reporters were waiting with more questions. He said only there will be announcements before long. Mr. Reagan had lunch at Republican headquarters, and as he was leaving, he was asked again about the cabinet.
I have made some decisions, and they will be announced on some. We have not completed the roster as yet.
Back at Blair House, more questions.
What are some of the positions you might announce without names? What are the posts?
I really can't tell you that either, because then that leads to...
Well, anyway, we'll have some by tomorrow. You'll be getting some news.
Mr. Reagan stayed inside for the rest of the day, meeting for nearly an hour with Hispanic leaders who supported his campaign. Later, he met with blacks who worked for the Reagan-Bush ticket. Outside, reporters kept their vigil, hoping that tomorrow at least some of the mystery over cabinet appointments will be ended. John Palmer, NBC News, with President-elect Reagan in Washington.
There is general agreement among the transition experts that Reagan's handling of the cabinet has not been politically professional. First, Al Haig has been on and off a roller coaster these last few weeks, as Reagan appears to succumb first to the pressure of the Democrats and then to the pressure of the right-wing Republicans. Tonight, for instance, Republican Senator Helms of North Carolina revealed that he called none other than Richard Nixon for clearance of any alleged Al Haig transgressions during Watergate. Second, transition aides have complained to the Associated Press that Reagan appears indecisive and unprepared to deal with the complexities of forming a cabinet. And finally, the Reagan press office will cite you chapter and verse to prove that Reagan really is ahead of the cabinet selection schedule set by his predecessors, when as a matter of fact those statistics reveal that Reagan is actually 2 weeks behind John Kennedy, 1 week behind Jimmy Carter, and only dead even with Richard Nixon. Roger Mudd, NBC.
Good evening. The Reagan administration began to take shape today as the president-elect named a number of people to cabinet-level positions. The choices, all male so far, all white, reflect the Reagan campaign themes of a conservatism that falls short of being extremist. Here's our chief Washington correspondent, Roger Mudd.
Reagan finished half the job of picking his cabinet today with a list of 8 appointments that contained no surprises because the list had circulated so widely. On the list were 2 old California friends, Caspar Weinberger and William French Smith, his former campaign director, William Casey, and the head of the nation's largest securities firm, Donald Regan. Notable by his absence was the president-elect himself and the man still rumored to become Secretary of State, Alexander Haig. But the others did appear at a press conference, although they answered questions as if they had been told to reveal the absolute minimum. John Palmer reports.
President-elect Reagan's first 8 selections were introduced at a news conference at a Washington hotel. Mr. Reagan's aides say he chose not to attend so as not to steal the limelight from his nominees. Other sources say the president-elect wanted to avoid reporters' questions about his apparent difficulty in finding a Secretary of State. He chose Wall Street financier Donald T. Regan as his Treasury Secretary, who shares the president-elect's desire for big cuts in government spending. Caspar Weinberger as Defense Secretary. He was Finance Director for Governor Reagan in California and held a top position in the Nixon cabinet. William French Smith as Attorney General, a longtime friend and Governor Reagan's personal attorney. Malcolm Baldridge as Secretary of Commerce, a former rodeo rider, now a Connecticut businessman. Pennsylvania Senator Richard Schweiker as Secretary of Health and Human Services, who opposes government-financed national health insurance. David Stockman, a conservative congressman for Michigan, chosen as Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Drew Lewis as Secretary of Transportation. He's now Deputy Director of the Republican National Committee. William Casey, Director of the CIA, the job now elevated to cabinet rank, a longtime friend of Governor Reagan's who served with U.S. military intelligence in World War II. President-elect Reagan issued a statement calling his choices a balance of experienced hands with fresh faces, new ideas, and seasoned perspectives, who have the experience, strength, and vision to recreate the American dream. Today's nominees were reluctant to say very much before they're confirmed by the Senate.
I've always made it a practice in the past in the various confirmation hearings that I've had to let the Senate have the first crack on any major substantive question.
Inasmuch as I haven't found the front door to the Department of Commerce yet, I think I'd better let that one wait.
Mr. Reagan's top aides say they hope all of the nominees can be confirmed before Inauguration Day on January 20th. John Palmer, NBC News, Washington.
The reason for the delay on Haig is obvious. Reagan still is trying to decide whether Haig would be a great enough Secretary of State to be worth a messy Senate confirmation fight, which several liberal Democrats promised today. Conservative Republicans very much want Haig to be in the cabinet, and today they were beating the drums for him. Howard Baker, the incoming majority leader, volunteered that Reagan had personally asked him to conduct an investigation of Haig's role in Watergate. Baker said he had found nothing improper in that role, and he pronounced Haig to be a national hero. But Reagan did today appoint 3 of his most important cabinet posts, and we have profiles of the 3, beginning with Treasury.
Unsurpassed quality and Donald Reagan, he's the man behind the Merrill Lynch bull.
At Merrill Lynch, it's our skill at guiding you.
Reagan transformed Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith, a conservative old-line stock brokerage firm, into Merrill Lynch & Company, a huge Wall Street conglomerate that sells insurance and real estate as well as stocks and bonds. Reagan lives in this house in Colts Neck, New Jersey, and owns another in Virginia. His salary at Merrill Lynch is $500,000 a year, and he owns $8.5 million worth of Merrill Lynch stock. Reagan is considered the most successful man on Wall Street, but that doesn't mean he'll automatically make the best Treasury Secretary.
The most serious question that's being raised is this: can a man who spent the last decade as the unchallenged boss of a big, powerful company adapt to the more circumscribed role of a government department head?
Don's going to have to learn to subordinate his desires to those of the president. And secondly, he's going to have to learn to work with Congress and articulate the president's program.
Today he began
that we must get the budget under control as rapidly as we possibly can, making selective cuts initially and then keeping it down.
Mike Jensen, NBC News, New York.
To get an increase in the...
Please direct the question to
Caspar Weinberger was from the beginning almost certain to become a member of Ronald Reagan's cabinet, not just because of his long and close association with the president-elect, but because of his reputation as a budget slasher. As Reagan's finance director in California, he was nicknamed Cap the Knife. As Reagan's defense secretary, he indicated that he'll continue to live up to the name.
Well, indeed, yes. We certainly want to look at everything we can find, because if we can save some dollars, those dollars can then be spent for more effective strength, more firepower, more of the things that may be required for the defense of the country.
But he conceded that it will be hard to build up the nation's defenses without spending more money.
I would expect to look over the the needs of the country, which I think are substantial now in the defense area, and recommend to the President whatever seemed to me to be appropriate, and that would, as far as I can tell now, certainly not be for a reduction.
Weinberger will now resign as vice president of the Bechtel Corporation in San Francisco. He joined the construction firm 5 years ago after he resigned as President Ford's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He's come back to government, he says, because he can't say no to a president. Hillary Brown, NBC News, Washington.
William French Smith is exactly the kind of man Ronald Reagan promised to bring to his cabinet, one for whom government is a step down. Smith will leave a lucrative law practice in LA's second largest firm, Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, with big corporate clients like the Bank of America, Rockwell International, and NBC. Smith has worked for Ronald Reagan since Reagan's political start in 1966 as a fundraiser, talent scout, and close advisor, but never full-time. In 1968, Governor Reagan named him to the University of California Board of Regents, where he has been a loyal conservative vote. He opposed student protests and involvement of the university in politics, voted not to renew the teaching contract of communist Angela Davis. When medical student Alan Bakke challenged the university's affirmative action program, Smith sided with the university. Smith is Mr. Reagan's own lawyer and an overseer of the Blind Trust, which has managed Mr. Reagan's money during his public life. Some will call their relationship and Smith's appointment cronyism.
As far as the Attorney General is concerned, that is a very sensitive position. And all I can say there is that it is important that any president have somebody in that position in whom he has total confidence and trust.
Heidi Schulman, NBC News, Los Angeles.
So what's left for Reagan are 7 more cabinet jobs and the UN ambassadorship. After that are 87 undersecretaries and deputies. And after that, about 100 assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries. All those names are going to be hard to remember. After all, do you know the name of Jimmy Carter's Secretary of Housing? Give up? He's Moon Landrieu. Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
Economic problems, and one of them, the man who's been nominated to run the Office of Management and Budget, has produced a scary forecast of the future. Details on that from our economics correspondent, Irving R. Levine.
The document, full of warnings of impending economic disasters, takes on a special importance because its author, David Stockman, will be a top economic policymaker in the new administration. Stockman's document warns of a gasoline line crisis within the next 5 to 15 months, panic bidding on world markets for scarce oil supplies driving up prices, sharply rising food prices by the fall of 1981 as nations compete to buy scarce supplies of grain, a 50% possibility of a recession next year. As soon as he was nominated to be budget director, Stockman began urging quick action to head off the disasters.
I believe that if we can come forth quickly and credibly with an economic program that offers the hope of revival, we can pull out of this very quickly.
Specifically, Stockman wants Reagan, as president, to declare a national economic emergency and ask Congress to deal only with economic matters for 100 days. Cancel all remaining petroleum price controls to encourage domestic oil production. Drastically cut government spending for such programs as food stamps and Medicaid. Enact a tax cut to stimulate the economy.
Some Reagan transition officials are dismayed that the Stockman document was leaked. They think it exaggerates the problems and could alarm investors and make economic conditions worse. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, the White House.
Members of the Electoral College today did what the voters elected them to do, gather in their state capitals and mark ballots for president and vice president. The ballots they marked will be counted in Washington next month. We hear there were no surprises, so NBC News sticks to its November 4th projection that Ronald Reagan will be the next president. Last week, there were reports that Nancy Reagan had suggested that the Carters move out of the White House before the inauguration so the Reagans could start redecorating. That story was denied by the Reagan staff, and this weekend, Mrs. Reagan denied it herself in a phone call to Mrs. Carter. Here is Mrs. Carter talking about that today in Washington.
Well, Mrs. Reagan called me yesterday and said that she did not say those things, and I haven't worried about them. I think it's a good time for us all to think about our country and count the blessings that we have this year, and pray for our hostages and for peace on earth, and to love one another.
The fight for Canada's oil.
Good evening. There was talk today that Ronald Reagan may declare a national economic emergency on the afternoon of his inauguration. The director of the transition, Edwin Meese, told reporters in Los Angeles that such a move would draw attention to the importance of doing something immediately about the economy. Here are two reports on the story.
Good morning.
Meese told reporters it's entirely possible that Mr. Reagan will declare the economic emergency by issuing a series of executive orders immediately after taking office, somewhat along the lines of what former President Roosevelt did in 1933, but not nearly as drastic.
I don't contemplate at this point anything as drastic as closing the banks or even the stock exchange. I don't think that the economic situations call for that kind of action. There was a particular reason, but it may call for other steps, major executive steps. The hiring freeze, other steps to control federal spending, perhaps some controls directed at the amount of borrowing by the federal government, which is one of the things that happens to be contributing to interest rates.
Meese was asked if Mr. Reagan still wants to curtail the use of a president's power to invoke controls on consumer credit.
Yes, he stated that he feels that is not a good way for the president or for the federal government to be involved in regulating credit. He continues with that belief.
Meese said a number of advisors are working on a variety of other economic steps to take in cooperation with Congress. Reagan aides say the specific steps that will be taken to revitalize the economy won't be announced until the second week of January, after Mr. Reagan meets with members of his new cabinet in Washington. John Palmer, NBC News, with President-elect Reagan in Los Angeles.
Declaration of an economic emergency wouldn't automatically trigger any action, but would be intended to generate public pressure on Congress to take drastic steps to fight inflation, including a cut of at least $15 billion in this year's $650 billion federal budget, to include huge spending cuts for highways, mass transit, national parks, food stamps, Medicaid, school lunches, and unemployment compensation. For his part, the new president would order a 6-month freeze on all new government regulations that cost business money. Big cuts in government travel, which now costs $6 billion a year. A slowdown in government construction projects. By reducing spending, the government could cut down on its borrowing, which has been driving up interest rates. These high interest rates have been leading to pressure on the Federal Reserve, as seen in a small but rare demonstration at the Fed today. Without help from the White House and Congress in fighting inflation, the Fed contends it has no choice but to slow the economy through high interest rates. Bankers agree.
It's really been the only game in town as far as an effort to do something about inflation, to respond to inflation and attempt to control it.
Declaration of a national economic emergency is not without danger. Instead of propelling Congress into action, it could create fears in investors and savers and do more harm than good. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, the Capitol.
Good evening. Ronald Reagan today picked Alexander Haig to be his Secretary of State, former Army General, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, former Chief of the White House staff in President Nixon's last days, friend and protege of Henry Kissinger, a controversial appointment. Less controversial is Mr. Reagan's other cabinet choice today, Raymond Donovan, a construction company executive from New Jersey, to be Secretary of Labor. Here's our Chief Washington correspondent, Roger Mudd, with more on the appointments.
Once again, Ronald Reagan did not show up to stand by his cabinet appointees. In addition, the appointees didn't show up either. Reagan's Washington press secretary said Alexander Haig had the flu, a temperature of 102, and couldn't make the trip. And Raymond Donovan, the spokesman said, was being kept under wraps because he said it wouldn't be fair to send him out to meet the press all by himself. However, within minutes, Mr. Donovan was located in the 8th floor corridor of the Reagan headquarters hotel, and within 2 hours, General Haig had risen from his sickbed in Connecticut to meet the press.
I'm, of course, very honored and very pleased
very excited to have an opportunity to serve our nation again, this time in the foreign affairs area and not on the military side.
The 56-year-old Haig is no stranger to power. In fact, he has attached himself to powerful men from the beginning. He is not a career diplomat. He is a career military man, and that has disturbed some on Capitol Hill. But what has disturbed the Democrats even more is Haig's role as Nixon's chief of staff. Although it's not altogether clear the Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are skilled enough to mount much of a campaign against Haig. We have two reports tonight on Haig's past, present, and future.
When Richard Nixon left the White House, Alexander Haig was there to give the thumbs-up sign. It was symbolic of his loyalty, which may now expose him to some serious questioning. Former Justice Department No. 2 man William Ruckelshaus recalls how Haig relayed Mr. Nixon's instructions to fire Watergate prosecutor Archibald Cox, saying, "Your commander-in-chief has given you an order." NBC News has also learned that Haig offered Attorney General Elliot Richardson support for vice president in 1976 if he'd go along with the Cox firing. Cox's successor as special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, supports Haig's nomination. He says he doesn't recall telling his staff on May 4th, 1974, that Haig had threatened him. But Haig's biggest problem may be a White House tape the House Judiciary Committee obtained, which is now locked up in the archives, a tape of June 4th, 1973, when Richard Nixon told Haig about what Nixon called that damn conversation about $1 million in hush money for the Watergate burglars. The President, "I think we can handle that." Haig, "I think we can." The President, "Bob can handle it," referring to Haldeman. Haig, "That's exactly right." And then Haig added, "Mr. Nixon should take the position you just can't recall. It was in a meeting." What may be on other White House tapes is unclear. Critics of the nomination who want to get into Watergate and wiretaps that Haig asked for could try to stall the nomination while they seek more tapes. Carl Stern, NBC News, Washington.
Haig's confirmation hearings will begin January 9th before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. If liberal Democrats on the committee have their way, Haig's Watergate relations will get close scrutiny, very close and partisan. Alan Cranston, Democrat, specifies.
Watergate, to the Nixon pardon, to wiretapping, to bombing in Vietnam.
Howard Baker, Republican leader.
Reagan certainly knows, as a politician, and a darn good one, that this is going to be the center of attention and interest in the press for a long time. But he knows as well that if he wants Al Haig, and if it is possible, if there's nothing to prevent his confirmation, it's his judgment to make on whether he incurs that expense.
There are 6,000 hours of tapes that have not been made public. Only 12 hours of Watergate tapes have been made public. The committee has many members who feel that it's appropriate to know what those tapes reveal, if anything, about the actions and the character of Alexander Haig before a final decision is made on his nomination.
I'm convinced that Al Haig will come through with flying colors.
Even though Republicans will control the new Senate, they still foresee plenty of bad publicity in the Haig nomination. Fairly or unfairly, it is rapidly becoming Watergate revisited. Tom Pettit, NBC News, at the Capitol.
Reagan's second appointment to be Secretary of Labor is 50-year-old Raymond J. Donovan, a blue-collar baby from Bayonne, New Jersey, who grew up to be a wealthy builder of subways and interstates, and who has an uncommonly astute political mind. Irving R. Levine reports.
Donovan headed Reagan's New Jersey campaign and came to the convention after raising $175,000 instead of the $10,000 Reagan had asked him to. As a young man, Donovan belonged briefly to the Brewery Workers Union, but as the millionaire head of a construction company, Donovan sat on management's side in negotiations.
I've been in management far longer than I have been in labor unions.
This fact evoked from AFL-CIO President Lane Kirkland a statement reminding Donovan that the Labor Department is supposed to foster, promote, and develop the welfare of wage earners. For his part, Donovan said he plans to
generally put my money where my mouth has been.
That indicates Donovan will work for Reagan campaign objectives, including a lower minimum wage for teenagers, fewer government job training programs, and fewer health and safety regulations for industry. Most union leaders took a wait-and-see attitude on Donovan, but the Teamsters who supported Reagan were openly unhappy. And AFL-CIO officials said it was the first time that they were not consulted on the choice of a labor secretary. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Washington.
Up ahead, there may also be trouble brewing for Donald Regan as Treasury Secretary. The Washington Post reported today that for more than a decade, Mr. Regan's firm, Merrill Lynch, has been promoting an investment called a commodity tax straddle, which the Internal Revenue Service has ruled illegal. Merrill Lynch is challenging the ruling of the IRS, which is, of course, part of the Treasury Department. Also up ahead for the president-elect are 5 more cabinet appointments, but from all indications, he will not be at any of those either. This city hasn't seen it done this way in years. Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
And while all of that was going on, the president-elect was in California tending to more mundane matters. Mr. Reagan did talk about his cabinet today, and John Palmer has that story.
President-elect Reagan was on his way to a barber shop in Beverly Hills when his latest cabinet choices were announced in Washington. He told reporters he doesn't think Alexander Haig will have trouble with Senate confirmation.
I am completely convinced that General Haig has the qualifications for this job and that there is nothing uninvented that could be brought up against him. I think he's the man for the job.
Then he was asked about his choice of Ray Donovan as Secretary of Labor.
He had the approval of labor generally, and I know his record, and I know his record with employees and with labor unions, so that I believe he'll be a completely fair man with regard to anything having to do with labor and management problems as faced by the Secretary.
Thank you. Later, he visited his tailor to be outfitted for his inaugural clothes. Asked why no women or blacks have yet been appointed to the cabinet, Mr. Reagan said, "Don't keep score until the whole thing is in," and said, "There is no plot to exclude women and blacks." One Reagan aide conceded that Ray Donovan as Secretary of Labor was not the choice of the Teamsters Union, which has vigorously supported Mr. Reagan, but that yesterday's appointment of controversial Teamster official Jackie Presser to the transition team was designed to soften the blow. John Palmer, NBC News, with President-elect Reagan in Los Angeles.
Alexander Haig's nomination could make him one of the most powerful secretaries of state in American history. Neither Mr. Reagan nor any of his cabinet choices so far, including the men he has chosen to run the Defense Department and the CIA, has any recent experience in foreign affairs. Haig does, and in the cabinet, his views on international matters would not be easily challenged. The man who will be Ronald Reagan's White House Chief of Staff said today the Reagan team is evaluating a proposal that the new president declare an economic emergency after he takes office. James Baker told Reuters News Service there's a possibility that we will do it. An economic emergency declaration was suggested by David Stockman, chosen by Mr. Reagan to run the Office of Management and Budget. There were some other Reagan choices today. Here's Roger Mudd in Washington.
There were just 2 certifiable Reagan appointments today. The first, Michael Deaver, a California public relations man and longtime Reagan political advisor, to be Deputy Chief of Staff. The second, that of Max Friedersdorf, to be the White House liaison to the Congress, could be among the most important appointments Reagan makes. Friedersdorf is an old Washington hand and had the same job under Nixon and Ford. How the Congress feels toward the White House, whether it gets its phone calls answered, whether its requests for political help get honored, all contribute mightily to the early successes of a new administration. If you don't believe me, just ask Frank Moore, who is Jimmy Carter's congressional liaison. There were 2 other names being mentioned in the cold Washington air this evening, that of James Edwards, the pro-nuclear, very conservative former governor of South Carolina, to be Energy Secretary, and James Watt of Denver, who has specialized in litigation against the very department he is supposed to be running. The names were also mentioned in the warm air of California today, and John Palmer reports.
President-elect Reagan virtually confirmed he will appoint Watt as Secretary of Interior and Edwards as Secretary of Energy. He did so in answering reporters' questions during a stop at a store to pick up meat. Referring to Watt, reporters asked if it was a good idea to appoint as Secretary of Interior a man who has spent years fighting environmentalists.
Fighting environmentalist extremists. I think he's an environmentalist himself, as I think that I am. And I think my record proves it, and his will also.
Then he was asked about the qualifications of James Edwards to be Secretary of Energy.
This has been a very vital interest of his, and he's as governor, he was involved in the governor's organization on energy problems.
Mr. Reagan also plans to name as Secretary of Housing Philip Sanchez, who served in the Nixon administration, the first member of a minority to be named to the cabinet. Richard Ling, former president of the American Meat Institute, is in line for Secretary of Agriculture, and for Education, a department Mr. Reagan wants to abolish, either Elizabeth Dole, former member of the FTC, or Wisconsin educator Barbara Thompson. Reagan aides say they intend to complete the long, drawn-out cabinet selection process by Christmas, hopefully by tomorrow, if all of the background checks on the potential nominees can be finished by that time. John Palmer, NBC News, with President-elect Reagan in Thousand Oaks, California.
And the news that the Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are trying to hire Terry Lenzner is bad news for Ronald Reagan. It means that the Democrats are indeed serious about investigating Alexander Haig's White House role in Watergate. Terry Lenzner is a former federal prosecuting attorney, the number 2 lawyer on the old Senate Watergate Committee, and a formidable interrogator. It once again raises the question, will Alexander Haig be a good enough Secretary of State to make a messy confirmation fight worthwhile? Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
Transition from the Carter to the Reagan administration is going more slowly than had been expected. One reason is that some possible choices for the cabinet have taken themselves out of the running, and the final nominees may not be named until after Christmas. More from Roger Mudd, our chief Washington correspondent.
The whole cabinet-picking process seemed to fly apart about 24 hours ago when Reagan himself began endorsing his choices prematurely. And in addition, the appointment of Alexander Haig to be Secretary of State changed the tone of the transition from one of teamwork to one of controversy. Haig himself was in the Capitol today trying to change it back. Tom Pettit reports.
General Alexander M. Haig, U.S. Army retired, arrived in Washington to plan the Battle of Confirmation. Seemingly recovered from his flu, he wore a camel's hair coat but no hat. Haig had all the appurtenances of the office he does not yet have, bodyguards and a Cadillac limo. He went to the Capitol, where his hearings begin January 9th. Will he overcome stiff Democratic opposition? I tried to ask him how it will go.
General, are you pretty confident of confirmation in these hearings upcoming next month, sir?
Well, all remains to be seen.
A safe answer, it all remains to be seen. For 90 minutes, he discussed his nomination over lunch with Reagan's buddy Paul Laxalt, Foreign Relations Committee Chairman-to-be Percy, Republican leader Baker, a Haig defender. Nobody but nobody wanted to talk about the Haig case.
There'll be so many opportunities for that, we won't spoil it for you.
So your answer is just right.
Really.
Haig will meet the Washington press corps on Monday. Today, in double-breasted dark suit and striped tie, he looked ready for the confirmation contest and ready to look like a diplomat. From the Capitol, he was driven downtown for more strategy meetings, with whom we do not know. He has more such meetings tomorrow. Haig, clearly preparing to defend his role in Watergate, will spend tonight at a well-known Washington hotel, the Watergate. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Washington.
It was yesterday morning when the shingles looked like they were flying off the Reagan Transition Headquarters roof. Political reporters say they can't remember a day quite so confusing since Reagan was elected. To illustrate what they mean, we have reconstructed yesterday's events. All times are Eastern Standard. 9:30 a.m. Jim Brady, Reagan's Washington press spokesman, says there's a possibility of more cabinet appointments. 11 a.m. The Washington Star hears that Philip Sanchez has lost out as housing secretary. 12 noon. The Washington Post hears that Georgetown professor Gene Kirkpatrick looks good for UN ambassador. 12:15 p.m. Thomas Sowell, the black economist, tells the Washington Post he has withdrawn his name, presumably for education secretary. 4:10 p.m. Jim Brady says no more cabinet announcements before Sunday. 5 p.m. The New York Times confirms that Marva Collins, a black anti-busing Chicago schoolteacher, is under consideration for education. 5:10 p.m. The Washington Star learns Sanchez is out because of a government report on his personal conduct. 5:22 p.m. Richard Ling arrives at Reagan's home in California to talk about being Secretary of Agriculture. 6 to 6:30 p.m., Philip Sanchez withdraws in phone calls to AP and UPI, citing financial reasons. 7 p.m., the name of Jewel LaFontante, a black Chicago lawyer, starts floating again for housing. 7:30 p.m., John Block arrives at Reagan's home, also to talk about being Secretary of Agriculture. 7:45 p.m., AP Washington learns that James Watt of Denver is giving Reagan second thoughts about running the Interior Department. And now, 24 hours later, the cabinet seems no closer to completion. If they expect to finish by Monday, they sure can't afford another day like yesterday. Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
Good evening. There was talk today that Ronald Reagan may declare a national economic emergency on the afternoon of his inauguration. The director of the transition, Edwin Meese, told reporters in Los Angeles that such a move would draw attention to the importance of doing something immediately about the economy. Here are two reports on the story.
Good morning.
Meese told reporters it's entirely possible that Mr. Reagan will declare the economic emergency by issuing a series of executive orders immediately after taking office, somewhat along the lines of what former President Roosevelt did in 1933, but not nearly as drastic.
I don't contemplate at this point anything as drastic as closing the banks or even the stock exchange. I don't think that the economic situations call for that kind of action. There was a particular reason, but it may call for other steps, major executive steps. The hiring freeze, other steps to control federal spending, perhaps some controls directed at the amount of borrowing by the federal government, which is one of the things that happens to be contributing to interest rates.
Meese was asked if Mr. Reagan still wants to curtail the use of a president's power to invoke controls on consumer credit.
Yes, he stated that he feels that is not a good way for the president or for the federal government to be involved in regulating credit. He continues with that belief.
Meese said a number of advisors are working on a variety of other economic steps to take in cooperation with Congress. Reagan aides say the specific steps that will be taken to revitalize the economy won't be announced until the second week of January, after Mr. Reagan meets with members of his new cabinet in Washington. John Palmer, NBC News, with President-elect Reagan in Los Angeles.
Declaration of an economic emergency wouldn't automatically trigger any action, but would be intended to generate public pressure on Congress to take drastic steps to fight inflation, including a cut of at least $15 billion in this year's $650 billion federal budget, to include huge spending cuts for highways, mass transit, national parks, food stamps, Medicaid, school lunches, and unemployment compensation. For his part, the new president would order a 6-month freeze on all new government regulations that cost business money. Big cuts in government travel, which now costs $6 billion a year. A slowdown in government construction projects. By reducing spending, the government could cut down on its borrowing, which has been driving up interest rates. These high interest rates have been leading to pressure on the Federal Reserve, as seen in a small but rare demonstration at the Fed today. Without help from the White House and Congress in fighting inflation, the Fed contends it has no choice but to slow the economy through high interest rates. Bankers agree.
It's really been the only game in town as far as an effort to do something about inflation, to respond to inflation, and attempt to control it.
Declaration of a national economic emergency is not without danger. Instead of propelling Congress into action, it could create fears in investors and savers and do more harm than good. Irving R. Levine, NBC News.
Good evening. NBC News has learned that President-elect Reagan expects to complete his cabinet selection process by Christmas. Over the past few days, it appeared increasingly unlikely that Mr. Reagan would meet the deadline he himself set for cabinet appointments. But as John Palmer reports, criticism that the president-elect was taking too long to make up his mind may have stepped up that process.
The president-elect's top aides, stung by criticism that the long, drawn-out cabinet selection process has been poorly managed, insist that the real fault is with the elaborate background checks and paperwork made necessary by the new conflict of interest laws. Reagan aides say the names of 3 and possibly 4 cabinet-level selections will be announced at a Washington news conference on Monday afternoon. Samuel R. Pierce, a New York lawyer who met with Mr. Reagan for the first time only last Thursday, has been chosen Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the new cabinet. Pierce will be the first black man named to a top position in the Reagan administration. Reagan advisors say Illinois Director of Agriculture John Block has been chosen Secretary of Agriculture. Block, a 45-year-old graduate of West Point, is a widely known successful farmer who raises hogs and soybeans on a 3,000-acre farm. Reagan aides say the fact that Block comes from a large Midwestern agricultural state weighed heavily in his favor. Despite protests by various environmental groups against James Watt being named Secretary of Interior, Mr. Reagan is expected to stick with Watt. It's expected that former South Carolina Governor James Edwards will be named on Monday to the post of Energy Secretary, a department Mr. Reagan has vowed to dismantle. The search for a Secretary of Education became more complicated today when former Federal Trade Commissioner Elizabeth Dole was named Assistant to the President for Public Liaison. She had been a top prospect for the education job. And Marva Collins, a black private school principal in Chicago, took her name out of consideration. Barbara Thompson, a public school educator from Wisconsin, remains a prospect for Secretary of Education, as does Thomas Melody, a university president from Connecticut. Georgetown University professor Gene Kirkpatrick, a Democrat with conservative views on foreign policy, is, according to Reagan advisors, the president-elect's choice as United Nations ambassador. Mr. Reagan spent today inside his home. Aides say he has begun work on his inaugural address. Tomorrow he plans to attend a public reception given in his honor by his neighbors. John Palmer, NBC News, with President-elect Reagan in Pacific Palisades, California.
President-elect Ronald Reagan in Pacific Palisades today told reporters he may call an economic summit conference soon after taking office next month. John Palmer has more.
President-elect and Mrs. Reagan attended services at a Presbyterian church a few miles from their Pacific Palisades home today. As they were leaving, Mr. Reagan was asked if he would agree to meet with United Auto Workers Union President Douglas Fraser, who has requested a meeting with the president-elect to discuss what Fraser calls the literal collapse facing the automobile industry. Mr. Reagan said he would be happy to meet with Fraser. On another subject, the president-elect was reluctant to say very much about how he plans to fill the remaining 5 cabinet-level positions in his administration.
There'll be some announcements this week, but listen, I'm holding up all the people in church. They won't let them out. Thank you, Governor.
Will they all be named by Christmas, sir? All named by Christmas?
I don't know. We're going to come close.
Reagan aides say most of the remaining cabinet selections will be named tomorrow at a news conference in Washington. They are expected to include New York lawyer Sam Pierce, a black, as housing secretary, John Block of Illinois as Secretary of Agriculture, James Watt of Denver as Interior Secretary, and former South Carolina Governor James Edwards for the post of Energy Secretary. A new name surfaced today for the post of Secretary of Education, a department Mr. Reagan has promised to abolish soon after taking office. The candidate is Edward Akire, a 51-year-old public school administrator from Santa Clara, California. Akire served in both the Ford and Nixon administrations, and his appointment would fulfill a desire on the part of Reagan advisors to have Hispanics represented in the new cabinet. John Palmer, NBC News, with President-elect Reagan in Pacific Palisades, California.
4 more people were nominated to Ronald Reagan's cabinet today, including the first woman named to the group and the first black. This brings the number of cabinet-level nominations to 14. 3 more are left, including the Secretaries of Agriculture and Education and the Special Trade Representative. Our chief Washington correspondent, Roger Mudd, has a rundown on those named today.
Reagan fulfilled his promise today to name a black and a woman to his cabinet, although the woman barely made it in as UN ambassador. Unlike the batch he named 10 days ago, today's appointments seem more like ideologues than they do managers. Here's the list. For ambassador to the United Nations, 53-year-old Gene Kirkpatrick, professor of political science at Georgetown University, conservative Democrat, highly critical of Carter's foreign policy, reluctantly leaves her academic life.
I don't know whether I'm going to be happy or not, but I decided that the job was important enough and challenging enough that I would give it a try.
To dismantle the Department of Energy, 53-year-old James Burroughs Edwards of South Carolina. He will be the cabinet's only Southerner, which accounted for the presence at the press conference today of Senator Strom Thurmond, who is Dixie's most famous Republican convert. For Secretary of Interior, 42-year-old James Watt of Denver, who worked at Interior under Nixon and Ford, but lately has made a profession of litigating against Interior. And for Secretary of Housing, 58-year-old Samuel R. Pierce, Jr. of New York, former Labor and Treasury Department lawyer under Eisenhower and Nixon, conservative and successful.
One of the things we have to do is look at all of our programs, see how they are being delivered, how they affect the people, and try to streamline that department so that the people will get the best they can for the amount of money that we can give the programs.
Two of the Reagan appointees were widely rumored during the past week, and therefore their names generated controversy. One, James Watt, because he seems unfriendly to his department. The other, James Edwards, because he seems unqualified. We have reports on each tonight.
Former South Carolina Governor James Edwards is a dentist from Charleston, an expert on drilling teeth, not oil wells. He is pro-nuclear and has no experience on energy issues. Ronald Reagan promised to eliminate the department Edwards will head, but transition advisors have cautioned that that will take a long time and require congressional approval. Today, Edwards said he would first try to
look for ways to reduce some of the bureaucracy in that agency and streamline it and make it more effective and efficient to serve the needs of the President, the Congress, and the people of America.
One way to get rid of the department is to get rid of its functions. Under Edwards, there will probably be fewer rules to administer, more freedom for industry. The new administration wants to speed up decontrol of crude oil prices, possibly decontrol natural gas prices as well, lower the windfall profits tax on oil companies, relax clean air rules, and open up federal wilderness land for oil drilling. During the campaign, Ronald Reagan surprised most energy experts by saying America could be energy independent were it not for government rules. Under the new energy secretary, the oil industry will get more incentives than ever to produce and prove whether Reagan was right. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, Washington.
James G. Watt is a lawyer, born in Wyoming, now the head of a conservative legal foundation in the West dedicated to fighting government regulation. He has Washington experience as a member of the Federal Power Commission and as a Deputy Assistant Interior Secretary. He also has strong views about developing federal land, speeding up oil and gas leasing in the West, creating what he calls a balance between developing natural resources and protecting them.
We cannot afford to lock up or utilize our basic resources for one specific purpose. We must have multiple use of those resources, as Congress has ordered through the years.
That philosophy alarms conservationists. They are appalled by the Watt nomination.
We're going to fight this nomination. We're going to resist the nomination in the confirmation process, and we're going to do our best to bring to light the kind of record that Mr. Watt has established, and we are going to express our concern in every possible way.
James Watt may prove to be one of Ronald Reagan's most controversial appointments, but his nomination is likely to be approved by a Republican-controlled Senate. Gene Pell, NBC News, Washington.
Also present at what the press good-naturedly calls the weekly Republican police lineup were Raymond Donovan, nominated last week for Labor, and Alexander Haig, nominated last week for Secretary of State. Haig got about 50% of the questions. He was not unprepared, but he simply chose not to answer many of them. Haig does not dress like a military man, but he sure looks like one, and he sure talks like one, using such words as billets and highly sensitive. Haig said today he hoped to follow in the legacy of George Marshall, the last military man who was Secretary of State.
I think it's awfully important to keep in mind that it's military men who know and see firsthand the dreadful sacrifices that conflict entails. And I know of no rational military man, especially one in our heritage, American heritage, who would be anything but an avid proponent for international stability and peace with justice.
The one question Haig knew was coming was about Watergate and his role as Nixon's chief of staff.
I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind that I have appeared before several grand juries, Senate investigating committees, court of law on these subjects, and nothing during that period indicated any culpability on my part.
Haig is obviously aware of the minefields he must negotiate on Capitol Hill, and today he proudly announced that he'd asked an old Democratic friend from Washington to help him through, lawyer and former HEW Secretary Joseph Califano. Carl Stern reports tonight on some of the new questions that have arisen about Haig.
Some matters concerning General Haig came to light only after the Watergate grand juries and investigators had finished their work. For example, documents obtained more recently show that Haig apparently told FBI officials not to follow regulations he knew existed when he asked for wiretaps of White House opponents. In a memo, FBI Director Hoover said they, meaning Haig and the White House, do not want anything in writing. The next day, under the heading Do Not File, FBI officials noted that Haig stressed that no record should be maintained. In fact, says the memo, he said if possible, it would even be desirable to have the matter handled without going to the department, though Haig later conceded he knew Justice Department approval was and is required for wiretaps. A different but equally serious matter concerns the tape transcripts President Nixon made public in April 1974, hoping to quell insistence that the tapes themselves be surrendered. On more than one occasion before the release, White House lawyer J. Fred Bizart complained to Haig that the president had edited out important passages, including, from March 22, 1973, Nixon, I don't give a what happens. I want them all to stonewall it. Let them plead the Fifth Amendment, cover up, or anything else if it will save it. Save the plan. We're going to protect our people if we can. Recent accounts of that period indicate that Haig said leave it out, the sort of conduct which, had prosecutors known about it, might have led to charges against Haig. Carl Stern, NBC News, Washington.
So Ronald Reagan is now 11 cabinet jobs down and 2 to go, education and agriculture. Tomorrow, same time, same place, his Washington headquarters will announce that Reagan has picked John Block, an Illinois hog and soybean farmer, to be Secretary of Agriculture. For education, no one is absolutely sure. Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
Ronald Reagan didn't make his deadline for filling all his cabinet-level jobs by Christmas, but he came close. Today, the Reagan transition team announced the names of the president-elect's foreign and domestic advisors and his nominee for Secretary of Agriculture. Details from Roger Mudd in Washington.
Ronald Reagan gave up today trying to finish his cabinet before Christmas. He still is unable to announce his choice for education, which now must wait until next week, along with his chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and his special trade negotiator. His headquarters says there is no difficulty with the education job, but it stands to reason there's not much of a waiting line to run a department Reagan has already promised he wants to dismantle. Today's appointments were expected. Richard V. Allen, 44, to be assistant to the president for national security affairs. A Cold Warrior, a former Nixon campaign advisor, Allen promises to become faceless after January 1 and not be another White House celebrity like Kissinger or Brzezinski.
Sometime between Christmas and New Year's, which time will pass one more year of my life. My birthday's on January 1st, so I'm pretty much guaranteeing to you that I'll sort of submerge by that time. You're seeing a disappearing act right now.
Martin C. Anderson, also 44, to be assistant to the president for policy development. A summa cum laude graduate of Dartmouth, an economist on leave from Stanford, Anderson says the economy is in serious condition and that Reagan has no magic wand to fix it. And John R. Block, 45, of Galesburg, Illinois, to be Secretary of Agriculture. Block, a West Point graduate and the operator of a 3,000-acre soybean and hog farm, was not afraid today to speak his mind. Andrea Mitchell reports.
Ronald Reagan's designated agriculture secretary believes government should interfere less with farming, but that farm products can be useful in foreign policy. When he was introduced today, John Block talked about using food the way OPEC uses oil.
The best way to use that food is to tie countries to us. They become dependent upon us. They can't help it. They're going to be far more reluctant to upset us, to get themselves into trouble with us, for fear not only will they lose food, they'll lose everything else as we deal with them. That food is a great weapon to keep the peace in the world, as I see it.
But Block opposes agricultural embargoes. He claimed that the Soviet grain embargo hurt American farmers more than the Russians.
I will recommend to the President that he review it just as he said in his campaign, and we look towards lifting it in as soon as is practical, and I think everyone's going to have to sit and wait how soon that is, but we'll just wait and see.
Block said that farmers should not be blamed for high food prices, and that he should be a spokesman for the agriculture industry because, as Block put it, a healthy industry is the best asset consumers can have. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, Washington.
The administration has just 21 days to go, and as the days dwindle down, some tempers are getting short and some old scores are being settled. Here's Roger Mudd in Washington.
Washington is not letting go of the old year very gracefully this time around. A certain mean, pinched quality has crept back into the daily life here despite the Christmas spirit. Not even poor President Carter gets a holiday benefit of the doubt. He falls on his cross-country skis, breaks his collarbone, and the reaction around town is, isn't that typical? Hamilton Jordan, the designer of Carter's 1980 campaign plan, writes in Life magazine that they lost because of the hostages, because of the helicopters, because of Brother Billy. It was Billy Carter, says Jordan, who wrecked our strategy for keeping the president in a non-political and substantive posture. Secretary of State Edmund Muskie lets his famous temper explode with a blast at Zbigniew Brzezinski and tells the Washington Post Brzezinski never should have had a press secretary or been allowed to make TV appearances. Democratic Governor Bruce Babbitt of Arizona, one of Carter's last guns in the West, breaks with Carter and calls his Western water policy a bitter pill. Interior Secretary Cecil Andrus accuses Babbitt of, heaven forbid, running for re-election. And finally, in Playboy magazine, along comes Hodding Carter, the ex-State Department spokesman, scorching poor old Brzezinski for being a second-rate thinker and poor old Jimmy for being inconsistent. Of course, nothing like that could happen under the Republicans because they are hiring people, they say, who can take a beating, can hit the ground running, can stand to have bad things written about them. They're looking for people, say the Reagan recruiters, who have a real SOB factor. Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.
And then there's the one Carter appointee so far who is being asked to stay on his job. He is J. Jackson Walter, the director of the Government Ethics Department. And the reason, according to a transition official, is that Mr. Walter is one of the few people around who can decipher the Ethics in Government Act of 1970.
With these population changes have come, of course, a realignment of political power and a whole new set of conservative lobbies and fundraisers and practitioners and spokesmen. Some of them are off the wall, but most of them are sophisticated, single-minded, very pragmatic, and unflinching. One of them is Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress. Weyrich once called Ronald Reagan a closet moderate, which tells you that his views of the Reagan cabinet are not exactly mainstream. What does Weyrich think of the general, Alexander Haig, running our diplomats?
I am hopeful that Mr. Haig will clean out the State Department.
What about Donald Regan, the Wall Street broker running Treasury?
A big mistake.
James Watt, the Interior Secretary.
Mr. Watt is probably the best nomination which Mr. Reagan made from the standpoint of the new right.
Malcolm Baldrige, the Connecticut businessman to head commerce.
Mr. Baldrige is, of course, a close friend of George Bush, and I suppose Mr. Bush is entitled to a close friend in the cabinet.
Ray Donovan, the New Jersey construction man at Labor.
Ray Donovan will not be the tool of organized labor.
How about the Energy Department under South Carolina's James Edwards?
That department, if it's going to be abolished, has to be headed by a strong conservative who will abolish it.
Your opinion of William Casey to take over the CIA?
I just am not convinced that Mr. Casey has the energy and enthusiasm to hit the ground running.
And do you like Jeane Kirkpatrick at the UN?
for once, maybe the United Nations will have a representative who's on our side.
Paul Weyrich may be all wrong about the Reagan cabinet, but unlike so many political spokesmen here in the Capitol, there's no doubt about where he stands. Roger Mudd, NBC News, Washington.